Hi everyone, let's wrap up slides 9 through 16 from class. Our first step is to look at the kinds of reforms that were being put in place during the Industrial Revolution, not just by individuals, but all the way up to political state changes. There will be a lot of reforms throughout the Industrial Revolution, but particularly in the Second Industrial Revolution. And the most important of all of these is going to be voting rights. We refer to this often as the franchise, the ability to vote. It's not quite the same, like you can't really replace the word suffrage with franchise, but they essentially mean the same thing, which is the right to vote. Men are also going to have problems, and we already discussed that women have these issues, but as you can see in Great Britain, it takes from 1832 to 1918 until they actually have universal suffrage for all men. And British women in 1928 are almost over a full decade behind US women who get their right to vote in 1919. So it's not that all men have the right to vote. It's that it takes time to get past property ownership, and then women clearly are going to be behind. The other big change is going to be through labor laws, particularly child labor. This particular timeline is also a British timeline, and essentially it's looking at changes in working age and how many hours a child can work, plus on top of that, where they can work. So 1842, children under 10 are no longer allowed to work in coal mines. Now, mind you, as all of this goes on, people are lying about their children's age. Children are lying about their ages. And, a minimum age of 9 does not mean you're not going to find a 7 or an 8-year-old working in a factory. It happened all the time. The takeaway here, though, is by 1881, mandatory public education for everybody from ages 5 to 10. So an elementary education for everyone. That is a big change. We're going to do the next two together. This is looking at promoting alternative visions of society and workers' movements. And specifically, we are going to look at Karl Marx and radical socialism in the form of communism. So labor unions are the first step. They're not very prominent in the 19th century, but their sole purpose is to come to some sort of agreement between management and the workers that makes everyone maybe not happy, but at least willing to go to work the next day. The Sadler Report in 1833 is Britain's first real attempt at looking at the conditions in factories and deciding how much reform government really has to do, like from a top-down approach. Because remember, part of what makes capitalism is hands-off from the government. Well, they take all this testimony from workers, they invite certain individuals to provide testimony live to Parliament, and when all is said and done, the Sadler Report is a scathing indication of just how bad things are in textile factories, in coal mines, and this is when the government realizes they do, in fact, have to step in and make some changes to the laws. The idea of reform from the government is in keeping with the ideas of something called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is kind of a reaction to other reform movements or other ideas of morality at the time. So we looked at utopian socialism previously. This is creating the perfect factory system where everyone has access to medicine and everyone gets good pay and children get to go to school, but profits pretty much don't exist. John Stuart Mill, who is one of the authors of utilitarianism, says that you can't do that. You can't undo capitalism like that. He also is very critical of religious leaders who claim that people will innately act morally if you stay out of their business, that you just have to maybe guide them a little bit, but that being Christian will ensure that good decisions are made. John Stuart Mill disagrees. Now, if you're like thinking to yourself, I've heard his name before, it's because we already talked about him when we looked at feminism. We said he was pretty much the first male of feminism. He calls for universal suffrage early. He writes about women being subjugated, and that is his wife standing next to him. But on top of just being a liberal, this idea of utilitarianism applies to women too. And what it says is that you have to have reform, but you have to do it slowly, gradually. Look for what is the best possible reform for the most people, and that is the direction that you need to go. Use empiricism. Look around you. Will wages be better? Should we work on living conditions or working conditions? And utilitarianism kind of guides the reform movement as it progresses throughout the 19th century. But so does this, people. Communism is born. Karl Marx is going to react to the slow pace of reform and provide his own vision of what society should be like. Now, whether by divine providence or just coincidence, Karl Marx's best-known work, The Communist Manifesto, is released in the exact same month that the Spring of Nations of 1848 begins. We had 1848 listed as a vocabulary term early. This is the year where we see revolutions popping up all over Europe, except for Russia, which is autocratic, and Britain, which has a parliamentary democracy. Therefore, we don't need them, or it's just not a good idea. And everybody is looking for the same things. They're upset because of the poor harvests. They're very concerned about inflation. They're discontent with industrialization. They feel that monarchs are too conservative and not interested in their needs. And the governments react to all of these very violently and successfully. But Karl Marx says that the problem here is capitalism. And what has to happen is we need radical socialism. Now, before I can explain how it works, you need to know the difference between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now, they are still the middle class, the bourgeoisie. We looked at that back in medieval Europe with the rise of the middle class. But they also are going to encompass the wealthy entrepreneurs, the people who have capital, who invest in industry and are definitely not the working class. That is the proletariat. These are the people who are underpaid, overworked, and are generally just taken advantage of in society. So what does communism look like? Well, according to Marx, in order to achieve communism, you have to have a revolution first. So the first step is that you have to have a revolution in the form of like a stage one kind of nationalist revolution. The people aren't happy, the proletariat rises up, they secure the means of production, and it is a bloody, bloody circumstance. Now, to secure the means of production pretty much means that they take over the factories, they take over the banks, they take away, or excuse me, take control of all the things that can make money. Now, there'll be a period of time afterwards where we will have that moderate form of government, as it were. This is a transition period. Those individuals who had previously had authority, who maybe were not quite as authoritative as others, are going to help train the proletariat in order to be able to utilize these forms of economy. But in the end, the final outcome is that this dictatorship that is created in this stage two kind of dissolves. And from here on out, there are no classes. Everybody takes care of each other, and we have a perfect society. Before we really move on to the next idea, I want to make it plain that you understand that there is no such thing as pure communism, and that there are so many forms of communism that we're going to give them individual names. Like, for example, this communism in the Communist Manifesto, we're actually going to refer to it as Marxism. We'll have Marxism, Maoism, Leninism, Stalinism. All of these leaders are going to interpret communism in different ways, but that won't be until the actual 20th century. So for now, we're just looking at communism through Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto. All right, moving on. Let's talk about these new classes that are available in the industrial age. First of all, the working class, the proletariat. The proletariat is just what Marx is going to call them. We're just going to call them blue-collar workers. We're going to call them the working class. They don't have a lot of skills. They're pretty much entirely expendable. And they're the ones who pretty much get all the abuse in the industrial society. Then we have the middle class. These are people who perhaps have an education or some sort of skilled labor, the people who are going to make repairs to the machinery, those people who can balance the books. But we're going to call them white collar because they wear collars that can't get dirty. They're not out there in the factory getting dirt on them. They're behind a desk and they're doing things that keep them clean. And now at the top, we have a new group. We call these guys the captains of industry. These are not just the wealthy. These are the wealthy industrialists who have so much capital that they can own large corporations. They're the ones who are making the jobs, building the factories, investing in the infrastructure, and even pushing imperialism. But when you hear captains of industry, you need to think incredibly wealthy. They will cause the landed aristocracy to be a bit upset because their authority and their title is going to be challenged by these nouveau riches, and it causes quite a stir socially. For the next step, let's take a look at the role of women. They're either going to be in factories or they're going to be stuck at home, and it will have profound impact on the modern. So those women who cannot afford to stay home are going to have to go out into factories. And in the first industrial revolution, that means that most of them are going to be in textile mills. There will be definitely a portion of women who are in coal mines, but if we're looking generally overall, they're going to be in textiles. Now, their children could also go to the factory, and as young as 5 years old, they could have jobs. You can see that there are some children definitely smattered in the factory in this larger picture on the top here. Now, middle-class women still could work, and maybe they felt like they had to, but usually middle-class women worked in some sort of office, that they had secretarial posts, they took letters and mailed things, but they're not going to be on the factory floor the way you see up here. The last group of women is going to be the status symbol of staying home. We refer to this often as the cult of domesticity. This is where you see the perfect woman with the perfect hair and the perfect dress and children with their little bows in their heads. Their job is to create the perfect environment for when their husband comes home. Now, their lives are not terrible. Maybe boring, but terrible they're definitely not. But if you're part of the working class, Marxist proletariat, then life is really darn hard. Not only do you have to work all day long, but then you come home and you still have to clean the house, feed the children, do the laundry. So work for women was a very much a game changer for how households are run. Our last key concept for this lesson is going to be looking at rapid industrialization and urbanization. This is going to be kind of like that presentation I showed you with all those pictures. What is the environment like? How are people living? And we already know that neither of them are in very good shape. So let's start with urbanization. As you can see by these charts, urbanization dramatically increased in the second industrial revolution. This is really apparent in the United States. Not only are we expanding industrially, but we are drawing in immigrants from all over the world for access to that industrialization. So you can see in a period of 40 years, if you're looking at New York, from 1.2 almost million people in 1860 to 3.4 million in 1900. That's practically doubling the population. And we can also see from 1860 to 1920 in the first column that we will see that there will be a dramatic shift from rural living to urban living. That shift to urban areas happens so rapidly that infrastructure cannot keep up with the population. People are going to be crammed into tenements, which are like apartments, except even smaller. They're essentially taking already existing apartments and then quartering them off in order to accommodate these populations. So we're going to see more people living in smaller areas. And when that happens, we're concentrating poverty, and slums are going to be the result. In these areas, we're going to see lots of problems, particularly violent crime and unsafe conditions. Now, because we are talking about smaller spaces, we're also going to be looking at smaller families. And we call these nuclear families. No longer are we seeing the trend where families are living with extended family in rural areas. Now we have an adult with their own children, and they are living on their own. The cities themselves cannot possibly keep up with all of these people and the needs that they have. So water pollution is going to be rampant because sewage is not going to be handled properly. Air pollution is terrible from all the factories, and we see that pollution both in the air and in the water, is going to lead to a lot of disease. Cholera and typhoid are particularly apparent. What we'll also see is that it's not just Western Europe that is affected by urbanization, or the United States. Because of industrialization, global inequalities are just generally going to expand. So, for example, although people are living in a middle class people are living better than they did previously, when we look outside of Europe and outside of the United States, we see that the standard of living is going to decrease because industrialization is going to lead to imperialism. All right, let's take a look at one particular disease that is going to be rampant in urban areas, and that is cholera. Cholera is a bacterial disease, and it is typically spread through contaminated water. And all throughout Europe from 1846 to 1860, we're going to see a lot of cholera. One in particular is going to be the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak. Now, these cities did not have running water in these tenements and apartments, so generally people had to go use wells. And these wells were located throughout the city so that each area could actually have access to it. But because of sewage, sometimes those wells got contaminated. And in this case, the Broad Street pump was the victim of a dirty diaper. Now, this is the first time, the reason that we're even taking a look at this is because this is the first time that we're going to use empiricism to actually decide what caused an outbreak and how to fix it. Dr. John Snow is a researcher and a medical doctor, and he is convinced that if he uses data, he can track exactly where this outbreak started. So he goes around this area where we see the cholera outbreak and starts asking them lots of questions, people who got sick. And he finds out that if you're looking at these two maps, these are his data right here, that the Broad Street pump is demonstrating far more cholera than other regions of the city. And he decides that the only solution here is that the city has to shut down the pump. When they do, the cholera outbreak rapidly goes away. Now, he was laughed at first for his research, but it is very clear based on his studies that empirical data can be used to further medical knowledge as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. If you have any questions, let me know, but we have wrapped up industrialization.